Netflix released a documentary on Michael Jackson that has people all over the internet threatening to cancel their account. In this video, I'm going to break down the accusations against him. Welcome to Criminal Motives. My name is Matt Phifer. I'm a therapist, coach, author who breaks down different events that are happening in true crime. If that's the type of content you enjoy, be sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications so you're notified every time I upload a new video. With all that being said, let's watch this next video together and I'll give you my breakdown after.
The mystique of Michael Jackson, a beloved icon, singer, dancer, trendsetter, the literal king of pop with too many Billboard hits to count. But his life was also shrouded with controversy and damning allegations, including criminal charges he once faced for child sex crimes. And that's now the subject of Netflix's newest docuseries, Michael Jackson, The Verdict. The three-part series explores what led up to the charges, the trial, and the shocking verdicts. But there are a few things that the doc missed, and that's what we'll take a closer look into on today's episode of Scandal. So let's begin with the charges against Michael. There were 10 in all, a pretty sizable number, and the allegations turned criminal charges were really severe. Here's how they broke down. 4 counts of performing a lewd act upon a minor child, 4 more counts of administering an intoxicating agent, in this case alcohol, to assist in the commission of a felony, 1 count of attempting to commit a lewd act upon a minor child, and 1 more count of conspiracy. And that last charge, by the way, stemmed from the allegation that he kept his accuser's family quote-unquote captive at the Neverland Ranch, not allowing them to leave. Now, these charges came down in 2003 in the wake of the shocking documentary Living with Michael Jackson that premiered the same year. Now, this doc was directed by famed journalist Martin Bashir, who was previously known for his bombshell interview with Princess Diana. His doc made waves almost right away because of the confessions made by Michael Jackson himself. Not only did this documentary give a look into Michael's life, specifically what it was like to live at the Neverland Ranch, it also described a nighttime routine that many viewers found uncomfortable, to say the least. Michael Jackson admitted to sharing a bed with children and denied any wrongdoing. He said, quote, "Why can't you share your bed? That's the most loving thing to do, to share your bed with someone. It's very beautiful. It's not sexual. We sleep in the bed. We have hot milk. We have cookies. We watch movies." And here's where I have to introduce the Arvizo family. Michael Jackson came to know the family after the youngest son, Gavin, was diagnosed with cancer. And according to the doc, Michael took the family under his wing and helped pay for Gavin's medical bills, so much so that he was eventually deemed cancer-free. Now, Michael eventually invited the family to live at the Neverland Ranch, and from afar, it actually seemed like a fairy tale. But in reality, was it a nightmare? After the doc premiered, a lot of questions arose about Michael's treatment of Gavin, Arvizo, and other children. And that eventually led to police questioning Gavin, and he admitted that Michael Jackson had molested him. And that is where the criminal charges came from. Now, all of this was walked through in the Netflix docuseries, and it gives a more in-depth look at the lengthy trial and Gavin Arvizo's gripping testimony. But when it came time for a verdict, there was a major shock. The king of pop, Michael Jackson, was found not guilty on all counts. He was free to go. And I have to say, the doc was very well done. It was really in-depth. I learned a lot. But as I was sitting there watching it, I thought to myself, okay, there are a couple of things here missing. And here's where we, the Scandal Squad, is focusing on all of that. Now, to start, we have to talk about the baby on the balcony incident. If you were around in 2002, I know you remember this. And if you weren't, here's a quick refresher. I'm telling you, I wasn't even 10 years old at the time when this happened, and I remember it. Everyone was talking about it because it was so shocking. It happened on November 19th, 2002, when Michael was staying at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, Germany. Now, he was there to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award, and there were fans crowding the outside of the hotel, screaming and cheering for him. But instead of just going to the balcony to wave and say, "Hey guys," instead he brought his youngest son, Prince Michael II, known by the nickname Blanket, to the balcony. And the backlash here was almost instantaneous. The video was all over the news, the photos all over the tabloids. Children's advocacy groups were everywhere calling for an investigation and maybe even charges for endangering the life of a child. But ultimately, German prosecutors found there was no wrongdoing, and Michael himself issued this statement. It said, quote, "I make no excuses for what happened. I got caught up in the excitement of the moment. I would never intentionally endanger the lives of my children." Even though Michael was never charged, the incident itself looked really questionable and caused huge backlash, but maybe even some reputational damage. Nothing, though, compared to what the sex crimes allegations caused, and that leads into the next bombshell that was left out of the Netflix doc: Wade Robson recanting his testimony. Now, before Gavin Arvizo came forward with the sex crimes allegations against Michael, there were already a slew of allegations. People found it strange that Michael was hanging out with kids and inviting some families to live at the Neverland Ranch. So, as a way to clear the air, the defense called some of these kids to testify, including, by the way, child star Macaulay Culkin, who then and now has repeatedly denied any allegations of wrongdoing at the hands of Michael Jackson. But one of the other kids that they called to testify was Wade Robson. And I say kid because he was a child when he met Michael, but when he testified, he was actually 22 years old. Wade's history is kind of similar to Gavin Arvizo's. He met Michael Jackson when he was just 5 years old, back when Michael was touring Australia, which is Wade's home country. Wade was then and is now an amazing dancer, so Michael took him under his wing. He later invited Wade and his family to live at the Neverland Ranch, and for a time, that's all it looked like happened. Wade testified in support of Michael Jackson's criminal defense, saying Jackson never touched him inappropriately, essentially rebutting what the prosecution was alleging. But here's what the Netflix doc left out. In 2013, a few years after Michael's death, Wade switched his tune. He filed legal action against Michael's estate, alleging he'd suffered a nervous breakdown following the trauma of abuse at the hands of Michael. In 2019, Wade and his family appeared in the HBO docuseries Leaving Neverland, where they detailed Michael's alleged grooming and sexual abuse of Wade. Interestingly, even though Wade recanted his testimony, this wasn't mentioned in the Netflix doc. And speaking of recanting testimony, by the way, I have to mention the Arvizos again. The doc left out whatever became of them. And you have to remember, Gavin Arvizo himself took the stand and testified about the alleged sexual trauma that Michael caused. But it may have been this video that saved the defense.
And Gavin was the one that asked him, "Could I call you Daddy?" And Michael said, "Of course."
This video is recorded after the Martin Bashir doc came out, in which the Arvizo family basically said, Michael Jackson's great. He's taken us under his wing. He's helped us out. He's done nothing wrong. So when Gavin came forward with these allegations, this video was played in court basically to say, hey, were you lying then or are you lying now? And breaking his credibility, at least from the defense's point of view. Now, the Netflix doc also failed to include any allegations against Michael Jackson post the trial. Now, I already mentioned Wade and all of his allegations, but there were more made by a former child actor, James Safechuck. The latter came forward with those allegations in 2014, claiming he was groomed by Michael Jackson from 1988 to 1992. He alleged it took him so long to come forward because of the brainwashing all at the hands of Michael and the shame he experienced as a result. And by the way, he also appeared in that HBO documentary. And again, this is just me speculating here, and we're going to discuss it more in our interview, but is it possible that both Wade and James came forward when they did because at that point, Michael Jackson was already dead? And that's another thing the doc didn't touch on. Obviously, this happened after Michael was acquitted of the criminal charges, but he died just a few short years later, and there were criminal charges involved with his death. Michael Jackson was 50 years old when he died on June 25th, 2009. He was just about to go on the This Is It tour in a couple of weeks when he was found dead at his Holmby Hills mansion in Los Angeles. An autopsy later determined Michael died of acute propofol intoxication after his personal doctor, Conrad Murray, provided him with multiple sedatives. This ended in a criminal trial of its own, with Dr. Conrad Murray being found guilty of manslaughter in November 2011. He was sentenced to the max of 4 years in prison, but served only 2 years and was released in 2013 for overcrowding and good behavior. And that brings you up to date, everything the doc covered and what it didn't. But I want to take a closer look with a professional. So let's bring on one of my all-time favorite guests. It's former federal prosecutor Nema Romani. Nema, as always, thank you for coming on Scandal. It's so good to see you. You're joining us from California, where the trial happened. And were you actually there during the time of the trial?
I was, Sierra, and this is one of the biggest trials in really Southern California history. Now, the only thing preventing it from being bigger was the fact that it wasn't televised. But this was really up there, maybe just a notch below O.J. Simpson, but in terms of trials of the century, it really doesn't get much bigger than this.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you too. I mean, we just covered the P. Diddy case. I had you on all the time, and it was huge. But if it would have been televised, I think it would have been like Johnny Depp, Amber Heard. And the same for this situation with Michael Jackson. So many people were following it, even though it wasn't televised. It was huge because it's the king of pop. And I guess that kind of leads into my next question. At the time, were you surprised that any charges, criminal charges, were brought against him?
I wasn't surprised because these rumors were circulating for really more than a decade, right? And you have a very aggressive district attorney in Santa Barbara that wanted to go after Michael Jackson, really wanted to go after him earlier from the 1993 incident. So when you had victims who came forward, I think there was pressure on him to act because people were asking, like, look, I'm sure there are a lot of people watching Scandal who are Michael Jackson super fans, so don't hate me in the comments, but I think everyone would agree at a minimum what he was doing was creepy, right? He's admitting to sleeping in the same bed as these young boys, so there was a lot of smoke there. Add, complaining victims, an aggressive DA, it really had the makings of a prosecution, which is exactly what happened there.
And I think it's tricky, right? Because you mentioned this. Everyone loves Michael Jackson's music. Let me say that specifically, the music. I mean, it's really hard to say he doesn't have hits. Every Halloween, I'm listening to Thriller. Like, amazing performer. I don't think that anybody could say that he's not. But then, as you pointed out, when we pair that with his personal life and just the changes even physically, it was jarring at the very least. And then this Martin Bashir documentary comes out where Michael Jackson's on cam saying, yeah, I sleep in bed with kids. Like, it's not a big deal. Why are you making it sexual? I mean, do you think that really spurred this investigation and put it into overdrive?
I do, Sierra. It's really that documentary, right? And we know the power of a documentary. I mean, we've seen it time and time again, right? It can be R. Kelly, Britney Spears, I mean, there's so many examples where it can really change the course of a legal case. The Menendez brothers, right? So now you have this bright light that's shined on Michael Jackson's estate, Neverland. He's there with young boys. Again, at a minimum, it's strange, right? Then you have DCFS, which are the social workers here in LA. They're getting involved, right? Now, ultimately, they ended up not pursuing a dependency case and taking Michael Jackson's kids away from him or taking the alleged victims from their parents. But all of a sudden, everyone's talking about it. And Sierra, you and I have talked about this before. Every prosecutor in this country is either elected or appointed by someone who is. So that type of attention and public outcry can really affect a legal case, which is what we saw here.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the case too, because prosecutors felt that they had enough evidence, obviously, to bring the charges. They took it to trial. They came, it was multiple week-long trial where they called, witness testimony after witness. They really brought all that they could do. And I'm wondering, obviously, it didn't turn out to be enough, but how do you think the prosecution did in terms of the trial?
I think they did the best they could with the hand that they were dealt, right? These cases, Sierra, they often come down to likability and credibility, right? When you're talking about sex abuse, because, look, it happens behind closed doors. There's no smoking gun evidence, right? Where you have a recording, and here they really didn't have any forensic evidence. They were really relying on the testimony of the kids and their parents, the alleged victims here. But the problem was, there were significant credibility issues, and I'm sure we're going to get into it. And I think what the defense did a good job doing is really sort of painting a picture of people who have changed their story, who have lied. Their timelines at best were inconsistent. At worst, they were outright lies. And they'd filed other claims before. So they really did a good job making the prosecution's witnesses seem like they were scammers or they were shakedown artists. And the other thing, aside from credibility, is likability, right? And Michael Jackson, like a lot of celebrities, they are very likable. And Sarah, I've represented celebrities. I've sued even more celebrities. And those cases can be very difficult because jurors, they're ordinary people. They can't help but be enamored by the king of pop. And I think it's hard if you're a prosecutor to get 12 out of 12 to agree on anything, right? Men and women. But now you have a celebrity, right? There's going to be some that are going to probably give that celebrity the benefit of the doubt. And then when you're talking about reasonable doubt on top of it, I'm not surprised that the prosecution was unable to prove their case.
Yeah, when you're talking about a celebrity, I mean, Michael Jackson was everywhere, whether it's MTV and people are watching him, you know, in their living room, in their bedroom, whether it's the radio and, you know, people listen to like music when they're in the shower. Michael Jackson is with all these people everywhere. They feel like they know him, they know his songs. And I mean, we've heard about people getting starstruck. If this is this likable man in the courtroom and they're like, wait, he couldn't have done all of these terrible things. And then you brought up the defense. This I think they did a really good job of kind of, you know, making the jurors question the witnesses. So, of course, we have this young man, Gavin Arvizo, who goes up on the stand, harrowing testimony. I'm sure I wasn't in the courtroom, obviously, it wasn't recorded, but we have that testimony. But at the same time, the defense comes forward with this video from the Arvizo family that was recorded prior to any of these allegations coming to light. And basically, they're saying Michael Jackson is like a father. He opened his home to us. He's this great guy. So that, to me, I really think that they did a good job of poking holes in the testimony when they were like, hey, we got this video saying you love Michael Jackson. You loved him then. Are you lying then? Are you lying now? What's going on? What do you think about that tactic?
I thought it was very effective cross-examination, Sierra. And look, you got to be sensitive when you're going after a victim, but they went after him pretty aggressively. And it wasn't just Gavin, his brother Star, Janet, the mom. There were a lot of issues with her as well. And it was just kind of piece by piece, this really meticulous cross-examination that really poked so many holes in the defense's case. Look, it's not easy to get an outright acquittal 12-0, but even the initial vote from the jurors, it was 9-3 in favor of acquittal. It was just a matter of trying to convince those three holdout jurors. So that's how weak the case was. I mean, it was strongly a defense case, and it was a defense case that was based in large part on cross-examination. Then, of course, the defense called their own witnesses, all sorts of other people, including, of course, Macaulay Culkin, who came and testified that he slept in the bed with Michael Jackson and nothing sexual happened, right? He wasn't given alcohol. So I think the fact that you have all these other witnesses on the defense side, as well as credibility issues with the prosecution witnesses, it really had the makings of an acquittal. And again, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. What I'm saying is, as a prosecutor, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And if you're relying on the testimony of victims and their parents, and there's credibility issues, you better corroborate that testimony with some sort of independent evidence. And, you know, they tried to with some of the staff at Never Never Land, with some of those witnesses. They had their own credibility issues. They had filed employment claims. They had stolen. So they didn't really have the buttoned up witnesses that the defense ended up happening. And you're sort of weighing the evidence there. And of course, we know that any tie or even closer to has to go to the defense. It was pretty clear that the defense's witnesses were more credible.
Yeah, credibility is huge in this case because something that you alluded to was the fact that the defense kind of brought this forward to the jury, that the mother here, Janet Arvizo, had a past situation in which she filed a sexual incident against someone else. And that, to me, they showed, you know, hey, is this a pattern? Are these Arvizo scam artists? They just want to have a big payday? That, to me, right away, I was like, okay, well, there's your reasonable doubt right there, you know, because they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And to me, as a juror, I would think, ooh, okay, maybe some reasonable doubt. Now, you also mentioned the defense having really strong witnesses. Of course, Macaulay Culkin, who way back then and even now has come forward and said, everything was great. Michael Jackson was kind of a mentor to me, a good guy. But interestingly, back when this trial happened, Wade Robson, who was a choreographer or dancer at the time, now choreographer, he testified and said everything was good. You know, Michael Jackson was a great guy. Nothing untoward happened. However, in 2013, after Michael Jackson's death, he came forward and filed suit against his estate and later became part of that huge, wildly successful HBO documentary, Leaving Neverland, where he alleged grooming and sexual abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson. So what do you make of all of that?
Yeah, look, it's hard. You're right. Macaulay Culkin even recently denied anything improper. Wade certainly changed his testimony. Listen, and I know the psychology of an abuse victim and why someone might deny it, might not report it right away. You know, but one of the challenges always, if you are prosecuting these cases or representing victims, I represent victims of sex abuse, is to explain the shift, right? And sometimes you'll bring expert witnesses and it's trauma and obviously they want to suppress it, they don't want to talk about it. But, you know, when you've given testimony under oath in a criminal case under penalty of perjury and then all of a sudden you flip it, it's a problem and it's challenging. And when you have a not contemporaneous report, a report made many years later, especially if it's about money, right? A lot of people think, well, this is about justice. Why don't you go to the police? Why are you trying to get money from Michael Jackson's estate, right? So I think it was some of those civil claims. And I'm telling you, as a plaintiff's lawyer, I file civil lawsuits all the time. But it was the previous attempts to use their children to get money, right? You had Chris Tucker, George Lopez, all these people testify that, look, they're using their kids of cancer to try to get money from us, right? And there's the J.C. Penney incident when they filed this lawsuit saying that they were roughed up by security, but maybe it was the father that was abusive. So, there were so many different ways that the defense was able to really do a really good job to show that the people that the prosecution was relying on were just not reliable.
Yeah, it's really tricky because you and I have talked about many other cases involving things like this. P. Diddy is a great other example where it took people kind of a long time to come forward with their accusations. And we've heard from many experts saying this kind of happens. It could be PTSD, repressed memories. It could be, trying to protect yourself. It could also be the fact that these allegations were against Michael Jackson, the king of pop. I mean, it's no small feat whether he has millions or billions of dollars. He's also a face that many people know and love. So that's tough. But all of this kind of amounted to a sweeping verdict in Michael Jackson's favor. We've kind of talked about this, now retroactively about like how it makes sense why this happened. But at the time, what were your thoughts, Nema? Were you surprised?
I was surprised because, we were getting reports, and because it wasn't televised, it was crazy. You have these reporters literally running out of the courthouse, doing their stories and running back in. That's why I think we should have cameras in every courtroom. It's ridiculous that we don't. But look, I was surprised because there was a lot of smoke there, right? And there were multiple prosecution witnesses, and there were multiple prosecution witnesses who were victims and staff, right, that were reporting seeing these sexual acts. So you would think, and kind of like the Diddy case, right, that you have victim after victim who's kind of telling a similar story, right, that would be enough for the prosecution to get over that hurdle. But it wasn't in both cases, right? Obviously, in the Diddy case, you had 3 victims. I think the issue there was the victims stayed in the relationship with Diddy or stayed in the personal or professional relationship. They didn't report it. I think that was the challenge, and that's why the defense was able to argue in the Diddy case that it was consensual. I think in the Michael Jackson case, the issue was the abuse wasn't reported right away, or the stories changed, and there were these other claims and lawsuits. So I think that it was just not enough when it was all said and done. And you got to tip your hat to the defense. They did a good job. That's what good defense lawyers do. They can attack the credibility of the victims, and ultimately they ended up carrying the day.
Yeah, the defense did just that, brought on a really strong defense. And in the end, Michael Jackson is acquitted of all of these criminal charges. But the question is, was there major reputational damage? Because as you pointed out, the allegations about, child sex crimes first came about in 1993. I mean, now we're in 2026. Obviously, Michael Jackson is no longer with us, but documentaries like this or Leaving Neverland come out. And I'm wondering if his reputation has been shrouded. Of course, he's no longer here. And actually, one of my coworkers, our editor, Mike, he brought this up today, and he said, I think if Michael Jackson was still alive, he maybe would be canceled at this point, but he obviously passed away in 2009. What are your thoughts on his reputation, and whether if this doc came out today, which it did, or this Wednesday rather, and Michael Jackson's still alive, do you think he'd be canceled?
I think so, because again, there's a lot of people that think that he was abusing these young girls. Now, young boys, that Michael Jackson was abusing these young boys. And look, and a lot of people think that he was abused himself by his father, and that's why he had the high-pitched voice, and that's why he was sort of living in that sort of trauma, right, of being a young boy. But I do believe that he would have been canceled, and frankly, I believe that this case tarnished his reputation in such a way that I'm not saying that it caused his death. Obviously, that was, Conrad Murray, and we were talking off camera. My old law firm actually defended AEG in that lawsuit brought by Michael Jackson's estate. But certainly his legacy was very different. There were people that thought that he was still guilty. Even though he's acquitted, he was essentially like an OJ, right? Not a violent murderer, but someone who people thought and still do think is a sexual predator. That's why we see so many documentaries about Michael Jackson and the abuse and what happened at Neverland, right? So I do think that it contributed to his downfall, personally and professionally. Obviously, he ended up needing prescription drugs, propofol, just to go to sleep. The 1993 settlement ended up coming out to light that he paid someone more than $20 million, right, to settle it. And even though the defense argued that it was the insurance company, and the insurance company made the payment over their objections, I still think a lot of people think, look, if you didn't do anything, why are you paying someone that sum of money back in the 90s? It's probably like 40, 50 million now. So I think a lot of that bad evidence came out, and ultimately Michael Jackson was never the same in people's eyes.
All right, welcome back. So I was much younger when these accusations very first came to light, and I also didn't have the type of experience that I do now. The younger version of me thought that this potentially could be a money grab. The older version of me still sees where that potentially still could be true, but the older version of me also can acknowledge that while these accusations may not be true, the behavior behind it was still highly inappropriate. I think that when people have the conversation about Michael Jackson and the accusations against him, they look at it from more of a black and white lens. Did he do it or did he not do it? And I think that we're missing a lot of nuance especially when we talk about children staying the night with him and staying in the same bed with him. And I think that even if you're a fan and you want to believe that he didn't do any of these things, I think it's important to also acknowledge the part that he admitted, the fact that he had children staying in the same bed with him. And even if we want to give him the benefit of the doubt, we can still acknowledge that the behavior was highly inappropriate. And not only is it highly inappropriate, but it can still cause harm and it can still cause damage because it's a violation of children's boundaries. Even if he didn't cross the line, so to speak, it still sets the expectation in children's minds that this behavior is okay when it's not. Now we have children that believe that it's okay to sleep in the same bed as adults. And we also have young people who grow into adults that think that this behavior is okay as well. Now we have children that are primed for grooming, and we also have adults that are primed to be groomers, or at the very least, don't see a violation in something that is actually egregious. Set their own children up for potential harm. Now, some of the other pushback that I get when it comes to the Michael Jackson accusations and cases is the potential that he himself was abused and harmed in that way. But the problem here is that that is not an excuse for poor behavior. And oftentimes we hear this a lot from people, that they themselves are a victim, they themselves have been violated in some way, and oftentimes people will use that as justification for the harm that they've caused to others. And while it might be true that they themselves were a victim or are a victim, it's not true that it's an excuse for poor behavior or violation of other people. This is the reason why it's important to go to therapy to get the treatment and the help that you need, so then you don't cause harm to others, because trauma is contagious. And when we're blinded or lack self-awareness in our own trauma, the need for our own healing, we then project and perpetuate that trauma onto others. So regardless of which side of the coin you feel about Michael Jackson, whether you believe that he did or did not do this, his behavior was still highly inappropriate. If you believe that he was a victim and violated as a child or was struggling with his own issues, it's still not an excuse for poor behavior. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. If you or someone you know is struggling with trauma or past issues or a toxic relationship, I do have links available for you to work with a therapist, a licensed therapist through BetterHelp. You'll get 15% off your first month of therapy. And also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you're notified every time I upload a new video. With all that being said, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video. You guys have a good one.